Yay. Oh my goodness. I cannot believe this is officially Ninjacorn Podcast episode 10. So
Wow.
welcome everyone, and welcome Sahaja today, my
Hey.
beautiful guest. And we're just talking about this of like how to introduce you, and because I wanted to get the essence of your power, right? And these great points that you shared, aside from the overarching, familiar things in our practices of martial arts and scuba diving and stuff like that. A big focus has been for you of women empowerment and career, as well as I hear architect, and helping to build, these organizational structures for your spiritual community, that you call it, the Sangha org, and that has a lot of pieces in that, which are really meant to be supportive for the student body, as well as just kind of helping like the overarching leadership be able to lead and guide students in this very seamless, effortless way, right? That's
Yeah,
teachings and stuff
that's
like that.
great. 100%.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to be here. Like I told you, I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited to share and talk with you because I feel excited about your endeavor and all of this. So I am opening myself up to be able to share. So, yay.
Thank you so much for being here. Uh, just kind of a overarching question. I probably have asked this multiple times with all my other guests, but I think I always love asking this question just to start off, is knowing, what you know now and kind of looking back to when you first started on the path. What would you have told yourself, or what would you have wanted to know, that would have been helpful, supportive?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's really funny because when I first joined this school, I joined at a time when it wasn't open. So it wasn't like we were out teaching or anything like that. And when I joined, I had to quickly like hop in, learn, where everyone was at, figure out where I was at, and rise to the occasion of all of these powerful, amazing people that were already in our school. And that did have a lot of effect on this pressure that I felt to, do the things and, focus on the things and learn a lot quicker. And so I think what I'd probably tell myself is that, hey, it'll all be okay. Like, like it will all be okay. And, all of the effort and everything you're putting in is obviously going to pay off. But I think back then, because I'm also a Capricorn, I was also very, putting a lot of pressure on myself and putting a lot of like achievement based things in front of myself. And looking back now, I laugh because I just feel so much more, in my power, in the relaxed state of things. I shouldn't say relaxed, but just more, in my power. So that's probably what I say.
Oh, okay. So beautiful. So now it makes me curious, can you maybe share one of those like really high intensely stressful moments in the beginning where you're like freaking out, trying to up level yourself, pressure, feeling from all sides, maybe a lot more pressure on ourselves more than anything, because I totally get that.
Yeah.
Um, how you kind of transmuted that or like overcame that, because that's real. That's happens all the time. Anybody probably listening in on this conversation, like, yes, tell me how to get over stress.
Well, I don't know if I've fully gotten over it. There's still so many stressful things in the world, but what I would say is that, especially in a spiritual practice, I know it doesn't seem like it would be, inherently stressful. It feels like a lot of the time spiritual practice is aimed towards reducing stress or relieving stress. But I've always found that when you have this healthy tension, it actually helps you to grow a lot quicker if you can put yourself in that place and then um, you know, understand that when you're in that place of tension, you're only like, expanding outward. If you can focus it, right? Obviously, if you're too stressed, then it doesn't work. And if you're too relaxed, it doesn't work. So it's that healthy middle path, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I think a lot of my tension when I first joined was there were a lot of people that were very successful that had been doing the practice for 10 plus years by the time I joined. I came from a background that my family was very working class. Like we didn't really go into college or go into, careers that were more white collar or tech careers or things like that. So a lot of my learning was literally learning this for the first time by seeing and kind of trying to pattern match and trying to follow what some other people were doing, and breaking past these limitations that I had for myself, right? Just from having been born where I was and learning,
Yes.
all the things that I had learned. But what I can say and the advice that I would give is figure out what you're good at and use that to your advantage. Um, because for me, like I didn't have all of that background. I wasn't, career savvy or anything like that. But I had, grown up in a military family. And so being like quick, like observation, understanding, hey, this is what somebody's doing. How do I pattern match that to something that I'm familiar with? And then how do I, learn where my weaknesses or areas that I could grow would be? And then how do I like really dive into that head first? To kind of extract that fear or tension and then work with it, right? So I was always very much like, I had to be aware and kind of very humble with where my weaknesses are and ask a lot of questions. But I felt like that put me in this interesting spot within our practice where, it is all about exploration and being open and sort of not being egotistical about who you are and where you are and what you've learned. So I did feel like that put me in a lot of in a place to really grow, if I was just open and asking questions and kind of like the little puppy dog that, wanted to learn all things. So yeah, that's probably the advice that I'd give for that.
I love that. Can you maybe be specific? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot in a vulnerable way of like what was a potentially perceived weakness that you felt like you had that you're like, okay. And then like how that may be transmuted or transformed or changed. Because I mean, I guess I can start off and share it with myself. Because for me, similar but different is I never identify myself as athletic or any kind of like physically super capable person. My thing in high school was kind of music, orchestra, my violin and stuff like that. And being on sports were specifically to just put it on my college application and not feeling like I was charging ahead with varsity, get to nationals and champion. I wasn't one of those people, right? So coming into this practice and like having this other side of meditation, mindfulness being this martial arts thing that was very physical, or it was running, right? To kind of get the body really strong in its own power. That was like, I would call that for sure a weak spot. I mean, I still remember I didn't even know the exact length of a mile running. So I would literally go to the local high school track and I'd run 4 times, be like, okay, I know I did a mile. Because I didn't have Apple watches then. There was no Garmin watches, So I was like, that's how I was able to hold myself accountable that I did a mile, and I didn't just run, less than that or something. So yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, no, it's interesting because the practice always puts you in the right place to challenge those things. So
Mhm.
whatever you think you are, guess what? The
Yeah.
practice is going to provide you the complete opposite to prove that that's not it, right? Like, so for your, case, it's like, I'm not athletic, but oh, hey, you're, now a master in Aikido and martial arts, which I would consider athletic, right? So
Hmm.
I think it's really cool. And I think like, when I think of weaknesses, I'm trying to think of something that, because a lot of my weaknesses and all weaknesses I feel like are mental, it's like in your
Yeah.
mind,
Sure, sure,
what
sure.
do you
Of
think,
course.
right? So, a lot of when I first started, I think I had a very, what's the word for this? It's like I felt really small inside. Like I never felt like I was like big enough or smart enough or enough
Yes, I get it.
for a lot of these things, right? And so I think a lot of my um weaknesses were that I felt like, I would come into the Sangha and we'd have these beautiful dinners and, I'd see people in their career and doing these things and, super powerful women, just running their lives in amazing ways. And I think I was always very intimidated by
Hmm.
just power and, putting myself out there. And I remember like going to, we had a Sangha event, everyone was really dressed up. And at that point, I was on the Forever 21 train. I did not have a lot of money, so I didn't have a lot of like fancy clothes or, and then I'd walk into these events and people are in like Armani suits and looking super sharp. And I'm here with like my $20 whatever, So I just always have this, feeling of being less than, I guess
Oh,
is
got you.
a better way to just
Mhm.
put that because, my whole life I've been sort of having to work for the things that I've had and all of that. And so I think, my perceived weakness is that I just didn't have what it took to be
Mhm.
successful.
Yeah.
But I think the cool thing about the practice is, like I said, it puts you in these places to really challenge that is that I took and what I did know, my resourcefulness and questions and being open and, asking all things and sort of, watching people and how they did things. And then I could easily, I wouldn't say easily, I could just put myself in those places again and again and again to learn. And I think now, in my career, I feel like I've done pretty well for myself. But it's by seeing that and putting yourself consistently in places to remove that weakness or change your perception of that weakness because I see now that it like helped me just be open and curious versus closed off and just thinking that I had already been successful at that point. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that would be an example.
Oh, I get goosebumps from that because I share that a lot of times, there's a beautiful gift and power in open-mindedness and open-heartedness. And I just hear you bringing that to all these different new situations that were, I'm sure, very scary because of all the unknowns. And you're like, but continue to have this open-hearted, open-minded curiosity, right? That really, it sounds like you just absorbed so many things from that piece.
Yeah.
And now, my gosh, on the other side of the spectrum, being like big honcho boss kind of thing at work, what is that? Do you ever have moments where you're in your like director leadership, role at work, female, super awesome career woman, and like see maybe aspects that you recognize of yourself from before in others when you interact? I'm like, oh, I remember that. Or and
Oh
this is,
yeah.
oh yeah.
Totally.
How do you engage? Like, how is that a trip? How does that trip you out?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. And it's funny because I still see things from myself even back then in my role
Yeah,
now. I
sure.
don't think it ever fully goes away. This like feeling, it's not imposter syndrome, but it's kind of like, okay, I'm here. Wow, interesting. I've never been here before. So
Yeah.
like, how do I then work with that? But yeah, I
Yes.
think the cool thing about it, having been where I was, and this is true for anyone, that has a certain level of success is you have so much more compassion for the people that you're working with, or when you identify these things, or you see them, fearful or trying to figure something out, or, I have, folks that I work with that I'm like, oh yeah, like I've been in that place where I've had to give a presentation and was scared, to even like say a word in front of this level of
Yeah.
person in a meeting or something. But I think that when you are in those positions, it puts you in this seat where you can kind of both help your past self by helping someone else, but then also help this person achieve their thing. Because you know that you have the sympathy and the compassion and the background to really dig into that. So it is, definitely a trip to see that. But I feel like it makes you it provides you depth, right, as a person and as a, person on the path. So like have you experienced that? Like especially where you're at now and
Oh
having
my gosh, yeah, no,
aesthetic
all the
and
time. All the
yeah,
time too. I would say I see it in correlation to like martial arts dojo. So if
yeah,
I'm helping the newer belts learn something or help prep them for a belt rank, I see all myself like as I was like, oh my gosh, but we have a great time, like you say. I think there's this beautiful thing that comes through from the practice of that compassion, right? For
Yeah,
not only ourselves, our past selves, and then the people that we are currently working with, that makes this beautiful, I find, an alliance of some sort that feels like
totally.
then as we move forward in however, whenever needs to get done, but also maybe is helping them to grow, it's both parties for sure benefit. I feel like I get so much from their growth, and it lights me up so much more, right? And it helps show me that even as they're demonstrating that courage, like it almost like encourages me more too in some ways, if that makes sense.
100%. Yeah, like it heals something from the past and brings that same thing. Yeah, and it
Yeah.
also like I feel like makes you more balanced about helping too because you're like, okay, I've been in that place and I know the things that help me. This person is different, but like you can have that compassion and then you sort of allow that person their own space to learn because on the other side of it, being the person on the other side of that challenge, you can say like, oh yeah, that helped me grow and whatever else. So I also feel that it provides me balance when I'm looking at things too, where I'm like, okay, it's not the end of the world. You can provide them a little bit more
Hmm.
support and all of that. So yeah, I think it's
I
cool.
love that. Yes, because balance, right, is this very lovely word. I love on the path and practice and the compassion piece or service. And I guess for you, any tips that you can share to people listening that has helped you stay balanced, right? That has helped you stay in a compassionate space and being of service. Because I feel like, I know for myself, if I'm being really honest, there was definitely a time during the years of practice where I felt very much burned out from service, right? That service, because it was beautiful in the beginning because I had this very pure intention, right? And then I felt like the service felt burnt out and no longer balancing for me because I felt like I had to do it. Like I
Totally.
had to do it because then I wouldn't be a good person, and I had to be a good person, and blah blah, blah, like all these had to, shoulds, need to. And I had to work through that, right? Which was really about looking at pieces of myself that I was not being compassionate with, right? And
Mhm.
that kind of self-love thing that had to get healed or integrated before it can then like come back out, and not like this, I'm going to be of service and it's not going to be drudgery or something. That sounds awful. The most non-Buddhist thing to say.
Yeah, I love that. No, that's a fantastic question because I think one thing that I've started to really reflect on, because I've also been in those places, especially with some of the things that I mentioned that I've helped with, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
in school. And, to be of service means that you are in a state of balance enough that you can provide that to someone else. And
Right.
I think sometimes in a spiritual practice, we get into this mind state of like, oh, selflessness and compassion and all of these things is like beyond myself. And it is to a certain extent, but when you're so beyond yourself that you're not grounded or you don't have that balance internally, then it turns into self because you're saying,
Mm,
like,
that's
oh,
right.
I have to do this thing, or I have this perception of what this looks like, and therefore I have to do this, but I'm hating it inside. And, then it turns into this self thing, and I've
Totally.
definitely been there. So yeah, I think like the burnout part, a really, really big piece is to make sure that you're not just doing compassion for the external, like, this is what I should do, because then you're taking yourself out of the reality of where you're at, right? Um,
Right.
Meaning like, hey, I am so burnt out. I have nothing left to give. I am a empty pitcher trying to pour air into this cup. Um, the person's not going to drink the air, right? So like you're like wishing this thing that's just not there, and that's like taking yourself out of reality. And in a lot of Buddhist practice, it's all about seeing the reality of the situation and being able to work from that place. And so I think it's taken me a long time to figure this out, and I still don't do it perfectly at all. But what I realize is when I start getting to a place where I'm thinking negatively about the thing that I'm doing, or
Sure.
like and obviously you're always going to have these things where you want to push yourself past, a limit, and you're like, grumpy in your mind. But like when it gets to the point where it's like detrimental and actually not being helpful, then I think to myself, hey, there's self in this anger that I'm giving to someone. So the energy that I'm giving to someone, even if I'm giving them, $1 million, and if I'm angry behind it, and it's
Ah,
like
yes.
not a selfless giving, then the intention is actually, and the energy is not going to be there to really like uplift and help. So am I really being helpful? And maybe with $1 million, like I could argue that maybe not as
Right,
helpful, but
right.
yeah, no, I think it's like thinking about the energy behind it and my practice and being really truthful and honest to myself. Um, and there will be days where I will say, no, I can't do that or whatever. And from the
Good.
person's perspective, it may feel like, I'm being mean or whatever else. But I think the honesty and the integrity and the like balance piece, so that I can then come back to them at, with a full heart and not feel mad about it, is what I've been really trying to work on. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of like how I've been trying to work on it lately and find that balance in myself.
I love that because what I hear you say is like coming back to ourselves to take care of that piece that's maybe feeling angry or whatever, that's, burnt out, is
Yeah.
a form of self-care and healthy boundaries, right? Which I feel like can easily be misperceived as selfishness, like you're being selfish, that you're not giving this, right? XYZ, but actually it's predicated on self-care and healthy boundaries when we are really honest with ourselves. And I love that you're bringing up that self-honesty, because you're absolutely right. When we are an empty pitcher pouring into an empty cup, that to continue to do so is just living in illusion, right? And that illusion is like for sure going to perpetuate suffering. People then are drinking this cup of supposedly water, thirsty as fuck, and they're like, why am I still so fucking thirsty? And you're like,
Exactly.
and then the resentments can build, and they're like pointing fingers at you, pouring me water, you're not really, and you're like, yes I am, and then it becomes like delusion, right? Illusion, delusion, and all this stuff like that. So I love your ability to be honest with yourself, and that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, any tips for people who are listening, because that is for sure a constant work in progress. I have a beautiful partner called my husband that for sure keeps me honest, and it makes me like so upset sometimes, but it's like a beautiful upset. It's like, damn it, it's because it's a growth piece, right? Every time.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think the advice that I give is really just like, because it takes time to actually feel that thing out. And what I would say is that sometimes, there can be ego even in helping, or like,
Yes.
wanting to be
Yeah.
this like perceived as good and great and the
Yes.
most lovely helpful person. But like if you're not actually internally aligned with that, that is a conflict, right? So yeah, I think like finding that is it's really one through meditation. I know that's sort of a cheesy answer, but like usually I know that's like on this
Yeah.
podcast, so everyone's probably like, hey, mindfulness, meditation, do this. But what I want to say about it is, when you finally get to a place of stillness in your meditation, or when you like feel that, it's a really good compass to then measure how you're feeling about situations in comparison
Ah,
to that. So like
yes.
whenever I've been in places where I do feel like I'm selflessly giving, or I'm doing something in a way that is in alignment with the Dharma and everything just flows. And it's not like I'm pushing it, and it's not like I'm trying to be something or be perceived a certain way, or, I'm not trying to, be like, a nun being like, I don't know, looked at it in a certain way, or like, very good with a halo over my head.
Hello. Mhm.
I just feel like I'm in a flow, and it's not it, that to me is the selflessness, where I'm not trying to get something. I'm not trying to like, give something in particular. It just comes at that point, and it just flows from that point. So I would say, the meditation piece is really just finding that place of like the stillness, and then finding that compass or whatever that feeling is, because everyone has felt that like natural flow and using that as a compass. Because if I don't feel that, and if somebody's asking me something and I know
Mhm.
it's gonna put me over the edge now,
Yeah.
and I know it's not something that I can do in the best way possible, then saying like, hey, and there are nice ways to say it. It's not like you have to be a jerk about it, but
Right. Thank
if you
you.
can say like, hey, I'm not really in a place right now to be able to do that. Ask me again maybe this time, or here's what I can give, and feel that like integrity inside.
Yeah.
Then I feel like that's a good way to gauge that, or feel like you're in alignment versus always trying to push or imbalance yourself in one way.
Yeah, I mean, and you're absolutely right because I feel like meditation practice has that purifying piece, right? And in that purity, there can be a lot of clarity that can be gained that quickly can be like, oh, that didn't feel right, or that's not going to feel really good if we just kind of play the tape out, through our mind of that piece. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there are definitely times where I mean, many, many times even now that I've pushed past some of those things and then felt the benefit of it after. But
Oh,
even
yeah.
that, like, there are times where you can only do that so much where your capacity just feels completely slammed, and then you don't come it back into balance, right? It's like if you're pushing on the gas
Yes.
24/7, eventually the gas is going to run out. But like if you can do it in a way and then come back into balance and then feel that, I feel like there's much more longevity in that versus just constantly pushing past limits. You know what I mean?
Yes, I love that because it makes me think of the word sustainability, right? And in our school, our whole lineage, right, it can be considered the fast path, right? Because we are using every aspect in our life to kind of just push ourselves right into that awakening, enlightenment, liberation, whatever it is, the word that you want to use. And what would you give for recommendations for those to kind of help have that healthy sustainability? Because I know for myself in the beginning, everything that was taught to me, it felt was like life or death, right? How to do right. It's like, and I had to do it 100% perfect.
Yeah.
And it was like, no, pump the gas pedal. It was like, I need to get there 200 miles where I live. Can I hit it at 215? I mean, there was so many extremes, right? And for sure, like I harmed myself, right? Both broken bones, injuries, whatever that can look like physical ways, but also emotionally, it'd be like distraught and burnt out and so that. So, like, what would you say? Because I think that's an important piece around sustainability when our energy and our power is getting empowered at such high states from our practice, right? So it's like, and then when like, how do you like sustain? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's funny because our practice is very different than, 99% of other practices where there's, a little bit of ours is about putting yourself in these places to break past limitations. And in order to do that, you have to, constantly put yourself in these places that are uncomfortable. And I think,
Right.
we're breaking past, thousands of lifetimes of things sometimes, and sometimes
Yes.
our own, feelings on certain things and breaking past, and that can be very, very draining after a while because you're kind of like constantly in the flame. Um,
Yes.
what I would say is that, and again, a lot of what I'm saying today is literally just from having had the experience over a number of years, and look back and be able to say, here's how I learned that, because I still feel like I'm constantly learning and constantly trying
Sure.
to figure these things out. But
For sure.
I think the two things that I would say, first is being able to have perspective, that there's a bigger thing at play, right? So you were saying, you would receive these things or directions and it would feel like life or death because, in that moment and in that time and space, when you're looking at that specific instance and you're so, in the moment, yes, it is life or death. And it is something within our practice that's actually helpful because
Yeah.
you're putting yourself in that flame and in that fire, and you're not backing away, and you're not like, oh, I can probably get to this, next lifetime, right? Like
Oh,
that's
yes.
not
Right, right,
fast,
right.
right? So I think like, like that is helpful, but then also having spent some time, in the study, I feel like being able to zoom out and understand, like, yes, that is something that I want to like dive into head first right now, because I do need to, break past this thing, and I've noticed a pattern in myself, right? But then also being able to zoom out, I can say like, okay, yes, that, but then I know that I'm gonna need to like balance out with some other things or move some things off of my plate to be able to focus on this thing, or you just have a broader picture of your practice and like the long term of where you want to go or how you're evolving within your practice. And then it's not so much like if you were fishing, on a lake and diving after every fish, it's kind of like, oh, you're just gonna sit there in silence and wait for the fish to come to you. And then you know how to like get that one fish, and then you lower your fishing pole and it's like still, and then you get that fish versus like diving after all of the fish as they come, right? So it feels like you can be a little bit more balanced in it and allow that thing to come to you and to work through it in that case, instead of just like, being a little Scotty dog running after every single
That's
being thrown. So I think that would be my first one. And then the second, kind of advice of what I've really started to work on, at least the last couple of years, is just always connecting into what the higher or brightest thing is, and then working from that place,
I love that.
So even it's the same thing as like seeing the bigger picture, but like when I'm connected into the highest, brightest thing, I can look at everything and say, like, oh, maybe this isn't the thing that I need to focus on right now, or maybe this isn't the thing that I need to burn myself out on, or maybe there's a thing where I can give 20% here and it actually gives me 80% of the results that I want. So it's much more refined, it's much more of a
Yes.
nuanced sort of
Yes.
way of working versus like gas pedal on every single thing. So yeah, but I think it takes time to like develop that out, and it takes time and experience. As you're going through, I'm sure with your practice you feel this now of like, oh, I don't have to maybe go 1,000%. Maybe there's just like the little minute things that actually kind of expand the results that I want. So yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like there is a huge advanced practice around simplicity, right?
Yes, 100%.
And so sometimes when I feel maybe over inundated with a lot of stuff, it's like, okay, what's one less thing?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the last thing that will like tip you over because you're like, I just can't do one less thing. I have to do
Yeah.
all of it kind of thing. But that brings perspective, right? In a healthy assessment way of like what is tuned into, like you said, the highest and brightest. And I love that. And that simplicity piece is I find very challenging for myself. And what I mean by that is I use a lot of martial arts metaphor because I just like had these awesome classes with my sensei. And so I'm like trying to integrate them. But one of them in weapons class is like, if you're in this kind of like side hasso stance with a wooden sword and you just want to cut straight down, how to do it without any extra anything. So, as my sensei would call it, without any kind of signal, right? As the opponent is watching you, because any kind of signal gives the opponent the heads up to be able
Yeah.
to move.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And so it's not only really centering yourself, but really being in this like very grounded, balanced place. Cause if you're up here in this kind of like anxious, like a young teenager or whatever, a young adult on the gas belt, like I just gotta get there. You're right. It's a lot of energy that can feel very overt, right? And very visible and noticeable, and how to kind of really dial it down to kind of the more subtleties of that, right? So you're kind of maybe breathing more from your center, your power, right? Navel center, and how to just drop the sword in such a way where it's as Sensei talks about it, utilizing gravity. Because if you're using gravity, which is already inherently around us, there's really nothing that you're adding to it. You're really just blending and being one with, if you will, and then you're just cut. And I have yet to get there, but when sensei does it in front of me and I try to block, I mean, every time it's like he's already sliced me open. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, and I feel it like inwardly. I'm always
Yeah.
like, oh, I feel it. And I can't not make a sound because it just gets me that way. Right. And um, I feel like for me, that's been kind of the practice that I've been more wanting to integrate after this whole journey, right? Because in the early years and maybe intermediate path, there's a lot of collecting of all these tools. So you
Yeah.
have a freaking tool shed, maybe you have a house full of tools, right? And then now it's like the refinement process is what tools do I actually need? What can I merge and blend? What have I maybe
100%.
morphed into a new tool and I no longer need the three tools to do the one thing, that kind of thing. So it's this letting go process that I feel like has been very fascinating because there is this also familiar comfortability with our muscle memory. It's like, oh, well, I need a hammer. You just go get the hammer. But then it's like, well, maybe I don't need that specific. I need things can be more refined and fine tuned, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Totally. No, 100%. And that actually reminds me, there's a story that I told this a couple times because it's one of my favorite like stories that I've used as an example for the path and sort of how you
Oh,
learn and
yeah.
evolve
Okay.
and getting into the experience. And I
Okay.
told this at maybe a couple thought songs, but
Yeah.
anyway, a number of years ago, I was driving, and at that point, like, I was trying to actually listen to the radio more in my car, versus like, because I'd always have these defined playlists.
Oh, yeah.
This was at a point in time where I was kind of like allowing the universe to come to me and like, oh, like,
Okay.
kind of like, I don't know, it was just a weird phase of mine.
Okay.
But
Fine.
anyways, I was listening to the radio and there was something where they were doing an interview with this young woman who she was like this prolific musician and she was really young, something like 10 or 11 or something like that. Like, yeah, super, super crazy. So she was talking about her experience because she had at a very young age shown like this really
Mm.
prolific ability to play music and to even like play these pieces that were extraordinary, like Beethoven and all of these things. And so at a young age, she went to Juilliard and she studied there. And the guy who was interviewing her asked her, because I think at this point in the interview, she was maybe 13, so she was a little bit older than when she, was
Okay.
going through this. And he said, well, I have to ask you, you're playing these really complex pieces. Does anybody ever ask you, like, do you understand these pieces? Like I know that may sound bad, but you're so young and you don't have as much of that life experience. Like,
Oh.
how do you connect to that, right? And
Oh, yeah.
she told this story where she said, yeah, a lot of people have asked me that. And I never really knew why, because I would say like I would hear the music and I would be able to play these pieces and people would have these experiences, emotional experiences with
Yeah.
music, and I would feel that, but I never understood why people asked me that question.
Yes.
She said, it's kind of like, when I first started, I would play the notes, play the notes, play the notes, then I would learn the chords, then I would learn progressions, and then, I would kind of learn all of the different pieces of the music. And then at a certain point, I was doing live concerts and all of these things.
Yeah.
And yeah, I felt like I was connecting to the music.
Mm.
But then there was one point, where she had this big concert that was coming up and, her father was really sick and he ended up passing away. And, after he passed, somebody had asked her whether she wanted to keep that concert because it was maybe a week or so after her father had passed, and it was kind of a big concert for her. And understandably, if she said no or wanted to reschedule it, like totally makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But she decided she wanted to keep the concert because her father had really loved her playing music, and that was a really big way in which they connected with each other. And she said, at that concert, she sat down to play a piece. And as she started playing it, she realized that it was a piece about loss and death. And it was something where, like, she realized for the very first time why they were asking her that, because she had played that piece so many times before. and had never really understood it until that point in which she had that experience of loss and death, you know? And so it was kind of this thing where in our practice, you know, we learn all these, you know, notes and chords and everything, and we're kind of like learning meditation, mindfulness, and all
Hmm.
of these things, but it's not until you get to a place where you actually have to practice compassion or be in the world and understand something, or be in a place where, you know, you're centered in this way, that like you actually start to have the experience and the direct experience and the reality of that, that it really becomes real. And so like what you're saying about the, you know, being
Shortcut.
in place and time, and you know, all of these you know, sort of being connected into the moment, and your sensei teaching you this thing of not, you know, giving an indication, like I think that takes time, because in the beginning of the practice we are running after those fish, and we are running after those tennis balls, like I said with Scotty, you know, so it's that's your keys, and you're like excited to learn, and it's all theory, and you know, yeah, you may have these bright experiences, but it's because, you know, you're putting yourself in that place of reality. And I think now, you know, having as much time as we've had, we're now starting to actually have really tough times and really like intense times where we have to not practice, but be in the reality of that situation that we've learned. So I think,
Hmm.
I don't remember the question you asked, but
I don't remember.
I think like that experience and what you were just mentioning about like being in the moment of, and like learning to like be centered and to experience things, is really that direct experience of reality, and not separate from, you know, because when you're thinking, and like you said, you have all of this tension, and you're kind of in your head about when to slice versus
Yes.
being in,
Yes.
you know, in that flow. I think that's like actual selflessness, right? It's being
Sure.
without self. It's being
Sure.
without, you know, this mind of tension and thinking, and against just sort of the reality of the situation. And yeah, I think now in work and practice and everything else, it's less about trying to do the thing like, oh, here's a place where I have to be compassionate, and like my bodhicitta is now, let me turn on my bodhicitta, but you actually like now sort of feel that compassion, and you feel sort of integrated into your practice a lot more. And that's kind of what I've been experiencing, especially, you know, having been through some things the last couple of years. So yeah.
No, I think that's beautifully said, and I think maybe provides hope, if that's a good thing or not, you know, for people listening, that that integration process absolutely happens, and there is really no shortcut way. That part of the experience is good, bad, and hard are so amazingly perfect for the whole journey. Because there's been so many times we'll ask, you know, if I would do it all over again, would I do it? You know, there's sometimes like the existential question I ask other practitioners. It's like, okay, so if you had a choice to reincarnate back in this human form on this planet, in this world, you know, knowing what you know, would you do it
Yeah.
again? And everyone, I mean, I get mixed responses. I get the hell no, I ain't coming back. Forget this place, you know.
Yeah.
I'm done, right? I
Yeah.
know. And then there are those that are kind of like, well, whatever eternity, you know,
Yeah.
deems me to do, you know, the work I will do. And I'm like,
Yeah.
impressive, right? And um I don't, and maybe one that's like, oh sure, I'd come back. But I think from those conversations, it helps me to reflect like, would I do it all again? And was it kind of worth it? You know, because sometimes some of the hard moments, I've definitely put a fist in the air, if not a middle finger in the air, of like, this is totally fucked up. No, this is like, no, and throw a big old tantrum like a 2-year-old, right? And when I come back into my more balanced state, looking
Yeah.
back, you know, I wouldn't change a thing. I really wouldn't. And despite some of those really tough times, and I think that would boggle my past self, where anybody may be listening, like, what? But I can't describe more than what you're sharing. There is these precious teachings, dare I
Yeah.
say, precious jewels that come from these direct experiences that can't come any other way. I don't know how else to say that.
Yeah, no, and if you reframe it that way that you just mentioned about like everything is all about learning and the lessons and what you're gathering, it's less about like good or bad or the
Right.
situations. Because if we could wave a wand and always have the easiest time, fantastic. But then you would get bored, and a lot of people may not think that, but like you would get bored, you'd everything would be perfect and everything would be happy, and then you're kind of in this place where you're like, okay, well, what is that next thing? What is that,
Yeah.
where am I being challenged? Where am I like actually learning?
Right.
And I can tell you 100% of the time that I've had something really challenging happen, like, a couple of years down the road, or maybe
Yeah.
shortly after, I run into an experience where that thing has absolutely unlocked this next level for the thing that I
Yeah.
need to do, right? Or to help someone or to come to a different place or understanding. So it's like nothing is lost by having a hard time. Nothing is, gained by having a good time. It's all just lessons learned, right? And then it always eventually it's kind of like a video game where you're like, oh yeah, that key that I got, unlocked in this I found in this hedge, in level 3, and all of a sudden level 10, it's like the thing that unlocks the castle at the end.
Oh,
Yeah, I think by reframing it that it's always just like what did you learn from it, and where can you like become, more in depth and have more wisdom. I feel like
yes.
it's really helpful.
I love that. Okay, take heart, listeners. Take heart. It's gonna be okay.
It's gonna be okay,
It's gonna
exactly.
be
Back
okay.
to my first thing at the
Yes,
beginning, myself, it's going to be okay.
it's gonna
Yes.
be okay. It really is, right? And so as you're focused around women empowerment and stuff, and so just kind of honing in a little bit on that. I love that. So thank you for being a female and practicing, on this path, because I feel
Mhm.
like there needs to be more of us and much more collaboration. But I feel like it's growing, so it's all good. It's going the right direction.
100%.
What do you see as some older conditioning, societal, cultural behaviors that females still carry or still operate from, that you're like, oh, definitely don't need that anymore? Any insights?
Yeah, I think there's this definitely still experience it, especially in, the corporate world. I can
Yeah.
tell you that like it is definitely getting better, right? And there
Uh-huh.
are women that are, depending on the company that you're in, are like bonding together and super supportive and willing
Mm,
to, spend time talking about their experience and
yeah.
mentoring and coaching. But it's not always perfect, right? And there are all these things that people are still working through based on, all of their, conditioning and past lives and whatever else that you believe.
Yes.
You know, and I think even the world still sets us up to have some of that, patterning. You can't break past it unless you're really, really aware of it and you're really, really focused on it. So I think a couple of the patterns that I see,
Mm,
one is like this competition and feeling like there's only a finite amount of resources available. So you have to constantly be in this battle. And that can be both in the career space of, roles or opportunities or things like that. Um, and then there's this kind of like jealousy of
others.
accomplishment for things as well.
Mm,
So competition and then sort of this like seething jealousy that like feels really negative when somebody is succeeding, that I feel like also I've felt or experienced, or even myself, like I've had these things too where I feel these things internal to
yeah,
myself, like, oh, I wanted that, or I want to be there, or I want to,
sure.
accomplish these things. So yeah, I think those would probably be the two main ones. But
Mm,
I mean, there's always like nuanced things, especially in certain situations where, you could be in a group of women and it's the happiest, most delightful thing and it's
mm.
really beautiful and connecting. And then all of a sudden, a guy somehow comes in the situation and like the dynamic shift. And it's so strange because you're like, wait, no, we were just all getting along. And even if the women aren't aware of it, there's like this weird little shift of power that happens sometimes when a man becomes involved. And maybe it's not like they may not be fully aware, but it's like, oh, all of a sudden, there's this little bit of a competition or something that somehow comes up, even if it's not like the guy's not, the greatest thing in the world. But it's still, it's like, I think it's these ingrained things that we just, unless we're super aware of them, or that we've done the work, or that we're very, very honest with ourselves, because sometimes we can say like, oh no, I don't have that. But like, if I'm honest with myself, I do notice these things come up in my mind sometimes. And I do notice when these things happen, and I have to be like very, very open with myself that I, feel these things, and I don't have to step into it. If I'm
Sure,
feeling
sure,
these
sure.
things, I could say like, oh, this is, and that's mindfulness, right? This is jealousy, and this is something that I feel towards this person. But actually, like, jealousy can be shifted to inspiration if you really are mindful of it and say like, oh no, wait, like, why am I jealous? I'm jealous because I feel like there's an opportunity that I'm not receiving, or I want to have that experience, or, it's something that I feel like, blocked from. And because this person achieved it, I have, this, um, you know, um, uh, feeling that I'm not going to have that opportunity because now it's taken, right? Or something
Right,
like, but
right.
then if you can shift it to say like, oh, okay, I know that these things are true, and jealousy can be inspiration. Actually, I'm going to be inspired by her because she did something that I find really cool and interesting, and I'd like to have a similar experience. So how do I make that opportunity available for myself, or find something that's similar, or now I have a new goal, right? And I'm thankful to her for indicating this in me so that I can like add something, right? And then the energy shifts, right? It's no longer like jealousy and she's a, whatever you want to, names you want to call, right? And she's not so good and blah, blah, blah. Like it's putting yourself in a place where you're trying to diminish someone's success.
Yes.
And if you can like be aware of that and truthfully honest with yourself to say like, oh, I am being a hater. I need to like take a step back and slow my roll. And I need to, shift this thing into something that actually helps me to orient towards that thing that I think I want, then it shifts it, right? And women can do that with each other if they use those sort of conditioning indicators to say like, okay, jealousy equals now I need to find the inspiration, or competition means, I'm working with this person in, a positive way to like heighten my success, right?
Yes,
In the
yes, yes,
competition piece, I think there's healthy competition where you're, kind of
yes.
like Wonder Woman in, her land
Yeah.
of
The
Amazon.
mascara, yeah, her
Yeah,
world. Yeah.
right. And there's this different energy to it where like you can be competitive and kind of like, funly
Mm.
competitive, and not like, oh, I want to demolish this person, right? That's a negative competition. So I think that
Mm.
I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think that there's definite things that are always there, or things that are there. They will be there until you look at them a different way. And
Yeah.
you can always look at them as like, buttons that you can then, switch your mindfulness on, and actually use to elevate yourself, and, find opportunities that you really want to do or you want to accomplish yourself. So
I love that, and it makes me think of my recent fascination with Chinese dramas, right? Soap
oh,
opera dramas, specifically in the Dynasty era. I've been really loving
yeah,
the Dynasty stuff with the
yeah,
flowing gowns and all that stuff like that. And there's a lot of politics and hierarchy with the emperor and the not only his wife or wives and concubines, and there's like all the imperial families, right? So there's all these levels and classes, and you're just making me think of those conditioning pieces with women, just utilizing this as like a little metaphor of like how ingrained, as females to be brought up to be this, asset, whatever thing, to be a commodity, right? To then like find some man of some kind of status to then be married to, right? And then now they're off and they can be taken care of by the men, which I wonder like how that still comes through. Like you said, it could be a totally happy go lucky group of women, and a male comes in and all is like,
yeah,
even if the
yeah.
male is not awesome, even if maybe he doesn't have some great status or
Yeah.
whatever it is,
He's not that cute. Who
it
knows?
does something, where like all all the, I would say, Chinese dynasty, conditioning comes up as like,
Yeah,
are you gonna be the man that takes care of me? It's so like, and this, you don't have to be heterosexual. I'm just using this as kind of like the example, right,
right.
of this dynamic. And it is absolutely fascinating. It kind of breaks my heart sometimes. I think being born in this female body this lifetime, I think it bums me out a lot of times because is when I talk with my teacher, it's very clear that my most recent last reincarnation was a guy. So I
Like, this is super bummer to know that.
super bummed because it's like I see and I continue to see, when a group of guys get together, there is this brotherhood that naturally will come together. Sure, it's not to say they don't have competition and jealousies and they fight over other, yes, but it's different. I don't even know how to explain, but I just can just say it's different. That brotherhood is just so there. Like I don't know. Can you say more to that, Sahaja?
No, absolutely. Well, I've thought about, or I've like reflected on this a lot because like going through my practice, I really wanted to be like very, direct and honest with myself about the things that I needed to work on. And I think when I first heard about like female conditioning, it was really hard for me to hear because it's really hard to hear that, you have all of these things that have been conditioned in you and it's because of, your gender or it's because of
Mhm.
whatever it may be. And, I actually had a really hard time with that initially because I'm like, well, the world put me in this situation and how dare you, like how, that kind of thing, right? And I'm like, well, it's the guy's fault and it's society's fault and it's all these other things, right?
Uh,
Outside of myself and sort of pointing fingers.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think like, when you actually just take it as like, oh, actually, I'm born in this, body to experience this thing. And back to my thing about lessons learned, like I'm
Mhm.
now in this, female body. There's a lesson learned and something to understand about the suffering of this being that I am. And
Mm.
so, and that can take so many different forms. But when you look at it that way, you're like, oh, okay. Thousands of lifetimes, I've been conditioned to believe that my power is in someone else. And
Totally.
I think the easiest way to control someone is to make them believe their power is outside of themselves, right?
100%. Yeah.
So whether it's like a woman, whether it's people of different ethnicities or backgrounds,
Yes.
if you make them believe that their power is,
Oh,
somewhere outside of that internally to them, then yes, they're gonna
oppression.
have. Yeah, exactly. It's like the easiest way to control someone. And I
Mhm.
think like if you look at religions, if you look at
Mhm.
anything, right? Certain religions tell you that you have this God that's outside of you. And again, not to put any religion or gender or beliefs down, I think it's just an easy way to then have, a captive audience that you can then, make believe things or push any one way.
Sure.
And so I think
Sure.
through our practice, like especially as women, I think it's this really almost revolutionary thing to say like, oh, like yes, I've been put in this place and yes, I've been conditioned to believe these things and to believe because it's true, like in some cases you would have a better life in the
Yeah.
physical, by
Mhm.
being in these situations and marrying well and whatever it may be. But
Yes.
then when you think about it, like this physical will all die and go away, and you will only have what's in your practice or what you've developed and the
Mm.
level of passion and awareness that you develop. So, like, actually, some of the things that we can do within our practice to heighten that and be aware of our, of our second intention and everything that we learn in our spiritual practice is actually more beneficial for that next lifetime or
Yes.
whatever it be. And then also within our practice, I think that's really cool is that we can find the power within ourselves either through our career, these practices like martial arts or scuba,
Yeah.
but you break past limitations and you actually see what you're capable of, and that's the cool thing. I think like, yes, we have all these different practices, but really all of them help to bring you back to the power and everything that's internal to you and really connect you into that. And I think also like helping to reframe power, because a lot of people hear power and they think like a negative thing. They think people that are power hungry or whatever it may be, but it's actually people with power do bad things because they don't have the humbleness or selflessness to orient that power towards something that's positive,
Mm,
right? Because there's
okay.
people that have a lot of power, that do positive things, and then there's also people with a lot of power that do negative things. So it has
Right,
nothing
right, right.
to do with the power, right?
Yes.
Um, and when you just reframe it as like power just equals energy, like
Yes.
how are you developing the energy that you have to then focus on the things that are positive? So yeah, I think for women especially, like our practice is really unique in that it's not just like, hey, I'm going to believe this thing outside of myself, or
Mm,
whatever it may be. All of these practices are used to refine your being and whoever you are now. And I think, for women, it may be more challenging to break past, some of these samskaras or karmas that we've
yes.
had. But it's the same thing with men. Like they are conditioned really,
The other
as well. They're, you think about them as the yang aspect that they're conditioned in this other way to oppress and do all these things. And,
yes.
if you were always pressing, like that doesn't feel good, right? Like you always feel very aggressive and
Right.
else. It's just you were rewarded for that in the first attention, and women were rewarded for this other thing in the first attention. So
Totally.
yeah, no, I think yeah, I know that again. I got into these like
I
passionate
love it.
things.
I love this discussion. I love your explanations. You have such a
Yeah.
different way to speak about the same things I feel so aligned with, and totally support everything you're saying and agree with. I totally 100% agree. I just
Yeah.
love the words you're using.
Yeah, I just think of it as like you just have to be a scientist, right? Like scientists look at things like objectively and they're like, oh, that's interesting. Like, oh, you put this and this together. Oh, that creates this. Wow, and it's like this like learning experience. So especially with the things that are really hard, like conditioning both female and male, I think when you look at it as a scientist to say like, oh, I just put myself in a situation with 5 other women and a man came in and I objectively saw this thing happen and I'm going to be aware of it. And what did I feel internally and what is my thing that's going on? Then it's less like hard to experience. But yeah, I think that there's so many things. I could go on forever and ever about this because it's just a fascinating thing to me. But
Love it. Well, I still want to stay on this topic because I have had, I think, currently more male guests than female, but I know for sure that's going to tip the other way soon. It's just a matter of scheduling all the stuff like that.
yeah,
But
I'm gonna give a shout out to for all women to join in our study to do more of these because I think it's helpful. Like we don't have a lot of women examples in some cases, and even when you look at things in spiritual practice, like some of
yes,
the big names that we know of, right?
yeah.
They're mainly male. So I think when you hear women talk about this, I don't think that there's less enlightenment in women. I think it's just we don't talk about it enough or we're more internal.
Correct.
So being able to talk about it, I think is really helpful for people to hear. So yeah.
Yeah, 100% agree. So in staying on the topic of women empowerment piece,
Mhm.
I'm trying to think, if there's like a question and continuing the discussion is, I know for myself, I struggled with it and I still see it too today in other women is I would call it insecurity. I mean, you might call it something else. Like you mentioned, this maybe belief or maybe just the conditioned response of believing something more powerful outside themselves. So there's this insecurity, this doubt, this disbelief, it's like me, to do that, it doesn't correlate for them to be possible. And so would there be any kind of instructional stepping stones that you could share to be like, okay, maybe try this, then try this, and then maybe try that?
Yeah, so your question is for certain insecurities about whether the power, like you feel like it's possible for you or the power is internal. Is there stepping stones to be able to connect to that? Is that
Is if it's outside of us and we feel
okay?
disconnected from that power, how do we connect to that and internalize that more for ourselves and not continue to play out the conditioned
Got
responses
it.
of it's outside of me, not gonna find rich husband, marry myself with a lot of status so I don't get my head chopped off in the Chinese dynasty world or whatever, poisoned or whatever.
Yeah, so two things come to mind with that. The first is by it's something that kind of to the point of like switching from jealousy to,
Oh,
inspiration,
yes.
whatever. It's like anything that you see outside of yourself is something that you recognize is inside of yourself. You just need to prove it so that you have, like you feel
Uh,
that confidence in it. So I think, anytime I've ever seen a guy do something, or, an example was, early on in the study, a lot of the people that would give advice about, karma yoga or career in
yes.
our practice were men. And
Uh-huh.
not because like the women weren't successful, it's just a lot of the men tended to speak up a lot more. Um,
Okay.
so, there was something in me that was always like, oh, well, that it feels like there should be more women that can speak to success in career or success in these things, and in order to get there, to be able to speak from that place, I actually have to get there. So for
Oh,
me to
right.
say like, hey, here's how you become successful in this, I have to do that,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because I have to put my money where my mouth is. And that's
Right.
been really like something for myself in my career, that it's like, hey, I have this, I'm a woman, I have a multi, cultural background. I'm not somebody that, has had this level of success in my family, really, like in some areas maybe, but not all. So in order for me to really like help people, I have to actually get there to then speak to it. So I think
Mm.
like if you treat things in that way where you're like, okay, I see this outside of myself, now that's a challenge for me to figure out how I can do that for myself. Like for me, it was career. For other people, it may be a black belt. For other people, it may be just, doing something beyond what they think,
Yeah.
is possible, and
Right.
taking out male and female from the equation, right? It's just
Mhm.
this person has done this thing. How do I figure that out to connect with it? And then knowing myself truly that I can do it, I have to challenge myself to it. You have to put yourself in the fire to be able to really experience that. So that would be sort of the first way to do it. The second, actually, I got a lot from like later in the advanced practice. I was really into going into nature a lot more.
Huh. Yeah.
And like there was something in my being that was like really, really craving being in like nature and like connecting back into this like, I don't know what it is. It just felt like my spirit really wanted to like sit near the trees or be in a field or, put my feet in sand. And I think what it was like looking back, and I still feel this a lot, is like being in nature connects you to an inherent power that is not like gendered in any way. It's like this centeredness that's, you look at a tree or you look at the ocean, it has a power, and it's not, embarrassed by it, it's not shy about it. It is what it is. And when you see like a huge wave, or when you feel like a huge gust of wind, or when you look at this really big majestic mountain, it's it's like pure raw power. It's not male or female or this or that. And I think it just gives you a different center and an understanding of power, that it doesn't have to be or look any one way, right? Like I wouldn't look at a mountain and compare it to the ocean and say like, oh, well, obviously the mountain is more powerful. Like, no, it's just different, expressions of power and energy. It's like inherent raw power and energy. And they may have different feelings that may feel yin or yang, but that's our mind putting that on top of,
Yes.
nature and calling it whatever it may be. And if you sit in like a field and you actually just sort of look at the grass and you look at the tree and then you look at another tree and whatever else is in your landscape, you start to realize that it's not about all of these things that we label it. It's just there's an inherent energy that you can connect to in nature, which is why we go to places of power and things like that.
Yeah.
And we can actually feel that. And when you feel that and you start to feel that in your own being, you're like, oh, like I don't have to be, this other person, or I don't have to, be connect my power to a man, or I don't have to,
Mhm.
compete with these other women, because I am inherently powerful. I'm a tree and that person's a mountain and that person's
Oh.
and it kind of like reframes a lot of things, because nature just like teaches you so many beautiful things that like, you don't have to force things, right? It just is what it is, and it's unabashed, and it doesn't feel embarrassed, and all of these other things. And it's just kind of a cool way to like put your being in these places to then feel that and then come away with it like having a different center of that energy. So those would be the two things that I would say.
Wow, I love that. And thank you for bringing in the outdoors and the nature. I would not have been able to be so eloquent about you explaining that power connection piece, but I think you said it so beautifully. It is very androgynous, right? And it can just be very also accessible, right, for people to be able to tap into.
Totally.
No matter where you're at, it doesn't even have to have a socioeconomic piece around it. You know, you just go, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's also a beautiful sense of wealth that comes from that power, being in nature and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a question for you.
Oh yeah, go.
Yeah, because I was thinking about this when we were talking, and you're talking about, women and women's empowerment and learning, and you've had this really beautiful. I mean, we both have this fortunate experience of having, and liberated teachers that we've learned from.
Yes.
But
Yes.
you've worked directly with a woman who, in her physical being
Yeah.
is a woman. So I'm just curious, like, how was that experience for you? Like, do you and obviously seeing our school who've had a fantastic male teacher, right? And
Yeah.
maybe it's just a physical thing, but I'm curious if you felt that that's helped you in any way, or that's been different in any way, or you felt like, I'm just curious how that experience was for you.
Yeah, great question. Oh, so many things make me think of. I'll start with the funny little cute metaphor meme when I talk with my teacher Taria and stuff like that, as
Mhm.
a way of talking about our different schools, like you said, male teacher, right, and female teacher, where we come from. It's
Mhm.
like we see you guys, and you guys are like the dogs, like very like okay, obedient, got to follow, and this
Yeah.
that. And she would call like her students the cats. Like we're all like, and she has to herd cats. So I feel for her sometimes because she's
Yeah.
like, you know, but that aside, I for sure very much feel to the core of my being like that was the appropriate, correct teacher that I needed to learn from in this life. Because for me, from all the past lives I've had a lot of structure and a lot of maybe more that kind of, you would call it that masculine energy and the action piece.
Yeah.
And so for me to have gone back into that would have been, if you will, like comfortable and familiar, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I think for the intention of awakening and enlightenment, that wouldn't have pushed me over the edge, if that
Oh,
makes sense.
fascinating. Yeah.
It would have just been like, yeah, I can do this. Okay.
Yeah.
Juggle the
Yeah.
balls in the circus. I'm that person that juggles balls, right? Throwing another ball kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe drop it a few times, stress out, get reprimanded, but okay, I can juggle the balls, right? And and in my time studying with Turia, it was not so linear. And a great example would be because our school has kind of been shifting and growing too. And
Mhm.
Turia has just put out the teacher training, program, right?
Nice.
For those that want to train and become a teacher in Trikaya Buddhism.
Mhm.
And the funny thing of it is this is my gosh, like maybe 15 or so years later that there's this formal structure.
Oh, how
And
funny.
the hilarity of that is all these prior teachers that have come through and students like myself and other of my cohort Sangha mates, we never had this kind of to-do list. So
Wow.
it's funny because you'll hear us sometimes bemoan and complain like, hey, how come we didn't have that? We didn't get that. The newer students or the teacher trainees are getting this, right? And another funny thing was a couple years ago, Turiya did an ordination for like the next set of monks in Trikaya Buddhism. And she printed out these beautiful, ornate, like certificates, right? Just to kind of really formalize it in this first attention world, something to be gifted to them, right? And one of the other teachers that was also a monk that was also ordained in my same cohort, I guess, saw Taria printing it out. And she's like, hey, I forgot one of those. And this is like, almost like a decade later, and never having
Yeah.
gotten these, the structured pieces, if you will. And it was funny because when they ended up getting ordained, the new monks, we ended up getting our certificates too. And that was kind of the joke. It's like, for myself, my joke was, damn, I didn't think I was a patient person, but fuck, I waited like 8, 10 years for this fucking piece of paper. Holy shit, like
Oh,
I
funny.
impressed myself on that piece alone.
That's so funny. Yeah. And so a lot of the like, unstructuredness in your practice and everything, like has that, not that it's been unstructured, because obviously like there's inherent structure in the unstructured too,
Right.
right? And that's the mind-blowing thing about our practice.
Yeah, totally.
Like how has that felt? And because I'm curious, given that, I've been on this other spectrum where I'm like, oh yeah, like, and we haven't had like super, I guess in comparison, maybe it feels like we've had like super structured, and yeah, there have been like progressions and paths. It hasn't been maybe quantified or like written down in any specific
Oh
way
yeah.
more recently, but yeah, like how do you feel like the unstructuredness is balanced or helped you in a different way?
Well, I would say off the top of my head, it was hella frustrating to navigate because I came, like I was saying, from that way more comfortable place of structure, and I felt like for the longest time, it's so fascinating how life and eternity teaches us this way. Is like for the longest time studying under Turia, I
Mhm.
would try to implement structure on everything. And what that would look like is being of service and then putting myself in a volunteer role right at the center that she would teach at, and then trying to infuse it with a shit ton of structure for the volunteers, for the meetings, right, and just structure.
Yeah.
And it was
How
it was
fascinating.
it was like the funny, not like serious, not really serious, but really serious thing. When we were driving one time together, I was like, you know what my dream is, and we were talking, I don't know what we were talking about, some form of service thing, how to be of service. I was like, I just want, you can have all the students, Taria. I just want to be the general to boss all the students around because I want to implement the freaking structure. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Top down. And that's so been my past lives. Like so many militaristic, organization and commands and down, and it was, it's now kind of a joke because I feel like after all those years practicing and frustrated at trying to infuse structure with this like nebulous, non-structured thing, my frustration, but like, oh, it's not working, or no
Yeah.
one's learning anything. And but lo and behold, here I am, like come through the other side, if you will, and
Yeah.
somehow it all worked out, right? And so
Fascinating.
so
Yeah.
now it's like I'm kind of like, okay, we don't need structure. I'm much more like accepting, open to that, obviously have been able to integrate that into my being. And now the irony is Taria's here putting all the structure on these new and she's like, what do you think, Ekajati? I was like, whatever, like,
Yeah, you're like, yeah, no,
yeah,
that's so fascinating because I always think back to the like, the spirit's journey or the soul's journey through their practice. And kind of like I said, if you just open up to the lessons learned and where life is showing you this
yes,
other side of things. Because like when I'm thinking about my experience, I'm a very structured person. So I think having structure, my hard thing was letting go of structure. So to be able to kind of like go into, more nebulous things because I was very comfortable with structure. And I think the interesting thing is I'm like hearing you is, because we've had structure, it's actually helped me to like feel comfortable with the structure, but then be able to let go in a different way in some cases. And even into the advanced practice, I feel like a lot of it for me has been like letting go versus
yeah.
trying to structure things. So yeah, it's super fascinating when you think about that spirit's journey, and like you were saying your past has been in this very like structured way, and then to let go into that. I think that's like really cool to hear about that with Turia and how that
Oh yeah.
yeah.
And also, I mean, to be so honest, is like I have an inherent like laziness, which is such a like a pain point for I'm sure many people, specifically my husband. He's like, "Oh my gosh, you're so smart, but all you gotta do is just put a 1% of your attention, and we totally get it." And you would like shoot to the moon and like bypass me, and like and I'm just like, he's like, "But you don't want to." I was like,
Yeah.
"Eh, don't want
Yeah.
to," and he's just like,
Yeah.
I was like, oh God, no, like,
Yeah. You're like, I'm good. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it's different, it feels like, I think, and this is the kind of interesting thing too, right now is, you kind of get to a place where you're like, okay, yeah, I could, but I feel like I've done it and that's not like, not that it's interesting or like you're trying to live any one way, but it's like, yeah, maybe there's different things that you're interested in and you want to like learn more of this other side. And it's not, again, to that big picture of things, like maybe it's not about just the achievement or doing this or that. It's a different experience that your spirit is looking for.
totally,
It's a
totally.
different perspective, especially in the school compared to, all of society that's like, hey, you have to do these 5 things and white picket fence and family and all
Right.
these things. It just feels like a different perspective on success or whatever it may be. So
100%, 100%, right? And going back to the whole inherent laziness, I'm so grateful, hindsight 2020, for all that past comfortability about structure, because I absolutely had to lean into that as a strength to help build some kind of foundation for me to then move forward. Because I know for myself, I wouldn't have been able to get to where I am here without having incorporated those strengths of mine, which was that structure and that discipline, because that wasn't necessarily what Taria or my teacher would have asked, right?
yeah,
She was kind of like, okay, meditate twice a day, be nice. Twice a day is better, she say, and she's like, and do a minute at least or whatever.
yeah,
And I'm here, listening to Rama's, talks and stuff like that, like 45 minutes, work up to an hour, morning and evening. And
yeah,
that's where I had to go to kind of set a precedence for myself.
yeah.
And so it's fascinating because now, on this kind of letting go of structure and right and being more kind of in the authenticity of what is right. Not saying structure is bad. I absolutely still do implement that into my life, but with the newer like teacher trainees coming up, you know it was fascinating in the beginning parts of like this very clear variance, I guess you could say. And I would have to catch myself. It sound like so judgy, I'd have to catch myself because I'd see and they're like, oh yeah, I haven't really got a chance to meditate for a little bit, like however a couple weeks. And internally I'd be like like, because that wasn't me. That wasn't how
Yeah.
I operated. That would have like that I would just like slice myself in the stomach. I would just like suicide, done. Okay, like that's just not how I work.
Yeah.
Um, so that is just been fascinating to observe how what was right and appropriate for me
Yeah.
doesn't have to be for the other person. And this is where it's been a huge other aspect in the advanced practice of like the meaning of skillful means. What is skillful means? How do I apply that? And in such a way that is not only for the highest and brightest of myself, but like for all beings, in this all interactions. And that's a big ask, to
Yeah.
eternity, to myself. I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. You're
Right.
like, I'm just doing the best I can with what
All
I'm.
right. Right. And so in kind of coming back full circle to where you're saying like, male, teacher and then a female enlightened teacher, I feel like is really about, skillful means and what we need, right? As students in the beginning, as we go through,
Mhm.
to help us. Cause I was talking to someone the other day and they're like, skillful means is just that you use it to the point where it's skillful. And once it's no longer skillful, you drop it. And I was like,
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
and I think like how true is that in regards to kind of the difference of going from intermediate path to advanced path?
Oh,
Because as I was talking to my friend, they're like, intermediate path for me was a lot of shoulds and have tos. That's what I'm talking about. It was like
yeah.
twice a day meditation, hour
Wow.
long, and like build it into your day. And it was like, you can ask my freaking husband, like, he probably has a little trauma from it that was so structured around it that if we had to go somewhere on a road trip, he's like, babe, we gotta leave at like 5 in the morning. I'm like, okay, fine, thanks, let me know. He's like,
Yeah.
do you maybe want to like meditate in the car or something so you can sleep
Yeah.
a little bit more? I'm like, nope, I'll be ready at 5 and I'll be up at like 3 and I'll get my ready and I'll do my meditation, right? And he's like, okay.
Yeah.
That's what I needed,
Wow.
right? So all these kind of shoulds, have tos, and stuff like that that I would put on myself in intermediate path was hard and challenging, but I thrived in that. I was definitely an intermediate student. Like I love the intermediate path. It's like, oh, give me one more to-do list. Like I was task master. You can tell me anything, I'm be tasked for myself, just like but and do it, line it up.
And
And
and it's so
yeah,
comfortable too, because it's like, okay, here's the thing, I'm gonna do the thing, and then I'm gonna like know that, check, I did the thing, and it's like this comfortability versus like this ambiguous kind of, okay,
totally.
yeah, I say it's like, the beginning practices kind of to that story I told earlier. It's almost like you're learning the music, and then in advanced practice you're playing jazz, right? It's like, hey,
Yeah.
actually I'm gonna feel whatever's there, and I'm gonna play
Yeah.
this thing, and I'm gonna like work with the other person and the other musician,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like you said, I love the way that you described skillful means of using it until it's no longer, needed, because you're seeing the reality of that situation, and you're then playing jazz with whatever is there and interacting with what's real versus,
Right.
okay, I'm doing this checklist that I've always done, and maybe something else needs to happen for you to learn this other side of things. So that's so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Like that skillful means piece
You're
of
welcome.
like 10 things in me.
10 things in that.
Yeah,
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 no, me too. Me
yeah,
too. Because it and going, from the intermediate, all those task things, like you said, you know, for me, once the power got developed and stuff like that, it became easy as a way of
yeah,
saying, even though there was challenging moments for it, there was like a easiness to it. So
yeah,
the advanced path was like, there was no more to-dos, there was no
yeah.
more shoulds, there's no more have-tos. And I was kind of like, okay, let me just sleep till noon every day. What does that do? Kind of thing, there
Yeah.
are these experiences that we come into the mind and you're like, oh, try it out. And then it's like, all
Yeah.
right, well, I kind of missed out on my whole day. Like I want to do some other stuff, whatever, right? But you start playing in this other not realm, but it's like it's another dimension, right?
Yeah, and you still have the cap on of like, I'm in my practice, because that's the interesting thing about jazz is like, and if you hear it, you're like, oh, that's just a random, assortment of things being played. But like when you actually learn about a jazz musician's background, they have
Yeah.
so much experience and so much tonal around their learning of the music and understanding all things that they can then break it and it sounds beautiful. Whereas like if anybody came off the street and tried to do that, like maybe they might sound okay, but they don't have the technical tonal and understanding of the practice and years of practicing to get there. So I think that's the interesting thing. Like a lot of people may see advanced students and say like, oh, and then it is a fine line too, and being honest and, having integrity with your practice is like you get to advanced practice, it could be very easy to just say, okay, I don't need to do that anymore. And then to get into this place where you're no longer sort of alive in your practice, right? And in putting your scientist hat on and continuing to experiment, right? But I think
Right.
that's the difference is like when you see an advanced student who's really, on fire with their practice still, like when I look at our teacher, like he's still doing these things in his practice. It
Yeah.
just looks completely different.
Yeah.
But it's because you've had these years of experience that you can then sort of play jazz in the advanced practice.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's hard too, because you kind of get to this place where you feel guilty that you're not doing the checklist and doing the things because you're like, well, but that was the thing that got me here. So of course
Right.
I'm hanging on to, doing these 10
Yes.
things that I always did. But then when
Yes.
you break out of it in a smart way, it's kind of like a scientific experiment of breaking out. You're like, oh, well, actually that helped with this other thing. And now I'm playing jazz and I'm like still aware and on fire, but I'm like playing jazz in this way that, I'm sort of experiencing this in-depth um level of dimensionality because I'm able to do that. So yeah, it's definitely this like it's like a scary thing to do, but then you do it and you're like, ooh, like what else is there that I can learn and, kind of combine in different ways, as I grow in my spiritual journey.
No,
Yeah.
100%, 100%, because I think exactly what you said is like all that, the guilt maybe of like, oh, maybe I should be doing XYZ on my list is
Yep.
we start to see, at least I'm starting to see more and more. It's like, oh, that was a skillful means, right? That was a skillful practice
Yeah.
that no longer now serves me. And so now what does? And there might be pieces of that, but in a very more jazz like format. I
Totally.
100% agree. You make
Yeah.
me think of like the jazz theory class I took once in school. And it like so freaked me out. Like it blew my mind because I had so much more respect for jazz music and jazz musicians. And it literally scared me because coming from kind of a classical background of like, here's a sheet of music, you play this, Beethoven or whatever, right? That was
Yeah.
the whole structure.
Mhm.
And they took that and they blew it, out the window. And I was just like, my mind was like
Wow.
blown. I was
Yeah.
like, yeah,
Love that.
amazed, impressed. Yeah, super. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
I love this conversation. It's like, so I was talking with someone and we were talking about advanced students kind of having these conversations because it is like playing jazz, whereas before we would have like, yoga sessions and sitting there and doing practice. You kind of get to these places where you have these informal conversations
Yes.
and you start to like unlock different things because it's
Yes.
multifaceted like awareness and seeing that you're like, oh yeah, here's this experience that I had. And, I think especially in the advanced practice, when you have folks that are going through it and, are having these experiences and you can talk about it, I feel like that's where the learning starts. It's kind of like, I'll send you this afterwards, but there's this YouTube series that's called, it's something like experts taught, 5 different levels of explanation, or I can't remember the title,
Okay.
but it's essentially like an expert in a field talks to 5 different levels of people. So they'll talk to a kindergartner, like it'll be something like an astrophysicist, and they'll
Oh,
talk to a kindergartner, an elementary school kid, somebody in college or high school or college, and then they talk with, an expert also in their field. And
wow.
it's super fascinating because, it's an astrophysicist and they have to figure out, with a kindergartner, how to share about astrophysics. And it's very like, hey, this huge, like big idea. How do I break that down for a kindergartner? And you can see that they go to like a very small basic thing that they then talk about of like, hey, gravity is kind of like this and whatever. And then they kind of show the kid how to do something and the kid's learning by like, actually doing over and over and understanding. And then you see the progression of how they start explaining this like really big crazy thing of like what they've learned until
Wow.
they get to the expert. And it's fascinating because you see when they get to an expert, they come alive because they can talk about all the crazy things within the people that are like not proven, that nobody knows. And it's cool because when you get to that level, when you're talking with someone, or you see them get to that level and talking with someone, it's less solid. And there's all these things that they're like, yeah, it's this, but also nobody has fully proven it. And we're talking about these theories, but like really it's all just theories because like, we're just looking at things that can't fully be explained and you have to experience it. And they're just like, shooting the shit and like going through all of these things that like they're just like geeking out,
Yeah, totally.
And the cool thing about the advanced practices, it's like that. It's like, we've
Uh-huh.
gone through these experiences and we're geeking out on, XYZ, and yeah, we can, figure out how to explain it for people that are new to the practice. But until you get in a room with those advanced students that have like been through it and that have like experienced all these crazy things,
Yeah.
it's really hard to have someone that understands it. So this conversation to me is that where you're just like, hey, here are these like crazy things, like
Yay.
let's talk about it, So
Yay.
I think we're doing this.
Oh my gosh, I've had so much fun. Yes, and I love the explanation. Yes, please send me the link because I'll add it to the show notes so
Yeah.
other people can check it out too, because I think that would be so interesting to watch. I feel like I want a second episode. I don't know about what with you, but I definitely want another episode.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm fine to go like do something like this again, or even just like go deep into something too. Because it's
Sure.
that's the fun thing about these conversations is so many things are uncovered, and it's like, oh wait, I could talk forever about just like women's empowerment, like, simply that, or whatever other topic. I'm game.
Maybe we should talk about Japan
Oh
and do a little
yeah,
comparison thing. Because you were on a different leg than I was. And I think you experienced
100%.
different things and stuff like that too.
I'm in. Do you want to talk about it now? I'm fine to jump in.
Oh, okay.
You're like, okay. Yeah.
I mean, but no, wait, no, I want to save it to another episode
Okay.
only
All right.
because I feel like I really want to dive into that and give ourselves like a solid hour plus on that piece. I don't want to like ship the iceberg and be like, okay, that's all, folks.
Yeah. We'll give people something excited to hear next time. So this will be the teaser for the next episode. Like, all
Teaser,
right,
guys.
join in next time for us to talk about Japan.
Yes, yes. I and just being mindful of time, is there anything that you want to add? Any piece that you feel like wasn't asked and you would love to be like, hey, please don't forget this is so important for people who are listening? Anything at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cool thing about this conversation is it's gone through like the spectrum of all sorts of things. And I think that on the path, that's the truth as well. You go through a spectrum of all sorts of things and you learn, right? And at the end of this, whoever's listened to our awesome conversation, the learning is the biggest piece. And in hindsight, to all the things that have been through my practice and life and everything, I think when you focus on the learning piece versus if you're ahead or behind or whatever, like those are helpful markers to just make sure you're progressing. But I think the lessons learned, if I look back and I'm able to be on a podcast like this and share those experiences or, be able to share, all sorts of things, I think that's the magic piece is you go through hard times, you go through all these things, but you share things at the end and then whoever then experiences it, even if it's just us listening to this and having this conversation, like I feel like I've learned so much just from,
Me
this
too.
time. I think that's the most important piece. Whether you're a beginning student, an advanced student, a teacher, a master, like all of these things just come through learning and being open to it, and throwing yourself in the fire every once in a while to really shake things up. So yeah, that would be my final little nugget of wisdom that I'd like to share.
Beautiful. I freaking love that. Thank you
Thank you
so
for
much.
doing this. This is super exciting.